Hello Year 11s and welcome back to Mathematics. In this video I'm going to be looking at graphical transformations in the topic of further functions. Now in this topic of further functions, we've looked at the graphs of a few different functions. So far what we've looked at graphs such as a linear function. So a linear function when drawn on a Cartesian plane will just give you a straight line. Let me pick a color. We've looked at graphing parabolas, so quadratic functions. And so when you graph a quadratic function, it will give you a parabola. And we've looked at the different types of graphing different types of parabolas. We've looked at a whole bunch of different other functions, so include such as polynomials. And so when you sketch a polynomial, sometimes you'll get funny, weird shapes like that. And we've also looked at most recently, if I can get this, we've looked at absolute value, abs value functions, and they give you this nice V shape. And we've also looked at hyperbolas as well in this topic. What this section is talking about is we're looking at what happens when we change up a few of these functions. So we learn how to graph these different types of functions. What happens when we change up these functions a little bit? So in particular, what we're looking at is what do we get when we graph, instead of f of x, we graph y is equal to f of negative x. Or if we graph y is equal to negative f of x, or combine the two together, y is equal to negative f of negative x. So these are three transformations we're going to talk about, and they have to actually do these three types of transformations: f of negative x, f of negative f of x, and negative f of negative x. Tongue twister, I know. These have to deal with rotations and also and also reflections about different axes. So that's what we're going to be having a look at in this lesson here. So first one we're going to have a look at is this red one. So y is equal to, if we graph y is equal to f of x, f of negative x. So what we have to do in these cases is have a function to begin with. So let's have a look at this example here. So I have a function here, x squared minus 4x plus 3, and that's drawn on this graph here on Desmos. Now, what we want to look at in this topic is have a look at what happens when we transform these functions using those particular transformations. So here we're looking at the transformation of f of negative x. So instead of having f of x, we're going to replace x with negative x. So let's see what happens when we try to graph that on our Cartesian plane. So what I'm going to type here is I'm going to put in y is equal to f of, instead of x, f of negative x. And see here, we have a different function in green. Now, have a look at the original function in red and have a look at the function in green. What's happened? What's happened to get from the red function on the right to get to the green function on the left? Well, what has actually happened in this graph here is we've actually reflected the graph along the y-axis. So we imagine that the y-axis is our reflecting line. If we flip our red function along the y-axis, we will get the green function there. So here, when we have y is equal to f of negative x, this is a reflection along the y-axis. So when we replace x with negative x, we have a reflection along the y-axis. So to find the equation of a graph which is reflected along the y-axis, we replace x with negative x. So that's what this kind of weird arrow tells me. If I have x, I replace it with negative x, and that will get me a reflection along the y-axis. So here we are graphing y is equal to negative f of negative x. So that's this first transformation. And a thing that we've actually dealt with this before when we looked at even functions. So if you remember, a function is even if f of x is equal to f of negative x. So if we reflected a graph along the y-axis and it gave us the same graph, that is an even function. So for example, let's do it. Let me just go to my Desmos thing, and I'm going to do another function. So let's do another function. Let's call it g of x. and that is equal to x squared. Now if I put on the same graph g of negative x, what you notice is that it's just the exact same function. So this function is an even function. And this is what we looked at before. If a function is the same, if you reflect it along the y-axis is the exact same function, then it's an even function. So that's a bit of recap on something we did before. But the main thing that we want to focus on here is the fact that if we want to reflect a function or draw the reflection of a function along the y-axis, we just draw f of negative x.